He looked up, squinting through the dusty haze. There, right by the wooden post, stood a skinny Apache girl. Her hair was a tangled mess, her bare feet caked in mud, and her eyes were filled with both hunger and fear. Without saying a word, she just clutched her empty belly. Her lips cracked and dry. Reed stopped what he was doing. He did not ask her name. He simply opened the gate and motioned for her to come in. The girl hesitated, but the smell of fresh cornbread drifting from the cabin lit up her eyes. In the kitchen, Reed placed a hot piece of cornbread and a cup of goat's milk on the table. The girl sat down, still wary, but the moment her fingers touched the food, she devoured it like she had not tasted anything like it in a long time. Elias brought over an old wool blanket and laid it near the fireplace. No one said a word. Only the crackle of the fire and the sound of hurried chewing filled the room. Reed sat in the corner, holding his pipe, his eyes occasionally drifting toward the child. Once her stomach was full, she wrapped the blanket around her shoulders, gave Reed a small nod, a silent thank you, and then quietly stepped outside, disappearing into the dusk painted with red dust. Reed remained seated, staring into the fire, overcome by a strange feeling. It had been far too long since this cabin last felt the footsteps of a child. 3 days had passed since Reed gave the Apache girl something to eat. He thought he would never see her again. But on the afternoon of the 4th day, just as the sun was turning a deep red and beginning to sink behind the hills, Reed spotted a familiar figure hovering near the fence. Tiva had returned. Her hair was still tangled, her eyes still cautious, but this time, she was not alone. Beside her stood a tall woman, face hollow, shoulders bare and marked with old whip scars, her left arm loosely wrapped in a dirty, blood-stained cloth. Her steps were uneven, but her dark eyes burned with fierce alertness. Reed set down the water bucket he had been pulling up and stood still on the porch. The woman stopped about 30 feet away, pushed her daughter behind her, then spoke in a hoarse voice drained by exhaustion. "We have nowhere else to go. I can do anything, haul water, cook, tend livestock, clear land. I just ask you to let us stay for the night." Even just under the porch, Reed stared at them for a long moment, without saying a word. The old dog growled softly, then fell silent. A gust of wind swept red dust across the field, rattling the weathered wooden fence. He remembered the girl eating cornbread days ago, her cracked lips, that awkward little nod. Now she stood behind her mother, gripping the hem of a torn shirt, her eyes still full of fear, but this time, with a flicker of hope. Reed sighed. He was not a kind man, nor someone who liked to get involved in other people's troubles. But in that moment, the emptiness of his cabin echoed with a familiar voice. "Do not turn your back on those in need." It was something his wife used to say, many years ago, back when she was still alive. He nodded and slowly opened the gate. "Come in." Without another word, Reed turned and walked into the kitchen, stirring the fire back to life. When the mother and daughter stepped inside, he pulled out an old wooden chair and set the last loaf of cornbread and a pot of beans on the table. Then he glanced toward the corner of the room, where a thick blanket was folded. "Sleep there," Reed said plainly. May bowed her head, her voice trembling. "Thank you, sir." Lahi sat down right away, clutching the warm bowl of beans, her tense face slowly beginning to relax. Reed sat across the room, eyes on the fire, asking no questions. He understood sometimes. Silence is the kindest thing you can offer. That first night, the little cabin was so quiet you could hear every crack and pop from the firewood burning in the stove. Reed lay on his old wooden bed, his back turned toward the mother and daughter curled up on the blanket laid out on the floor. He was used to being alone, but tonight, the sound of someone else breathing in the same room stirred something in him. It was not discomfort, just unfamiliar. The next morning, when Reed went out to draw water from the well, May was already up. She limped along with another bucket, her shoulders trembling from the pain, but her face was set with determination. "Let me do it," she said firmly, as if she had to prove her worth. Reed said nothing. He simply took the bucket from her and set it down beside the well. In the cattle shed, as Reed was tying the hay rack back together, he noticed Tiva trotting in after him. The little girl placed a handful of hay in front of a calf, her eyes lighting up with delight. Reed paused for a second, looked at her, then gave a quiet nod. He did not smile, but the coldness in his gaze softened just a bit. By noon, when Elias returned from the fields, He saw the porch had been swept clean, and his torn shirts had been patched with rough thread. Awanada sat leaning against a post, her left arm still hurting, but her eyes were brighter, like someone who had found a sliver of purpose after running for too long. Reed paused on the steps, caught off guard. It had been years since anyone touched his things, and now someone was quietly tending to them. That evening, dinner was a quiet affair. Awanada had seasoned the pot of beans with a few herbs she carried in a cloth pouch. Reed took a bite, a gentle warmth spreading across his tongue. He said nothing, just kept eating. But there was a subtle shift in his expression, something gentler flickered in his eyes. Tiva sat beside her mother and let out a soft giggle the first time Reed had heard her laugh. It was faint, childlike, and he realized it had been far too long since he had heard a sound like that. The next day, while Reed was out repairing the fence, he saw Awanada moving slowly on a crutch, gathering dry grass. Her injury still pained her, but she did not stop. She worked steadily, never leaving the job half done. Reed walked over, took the bundle from her shoulder, and placed it onto the cart. They looked at each other, not a word exchanged, just a quiet understanding. 3 days had passed. The cabin, once so used to silence, now held the sounds of footsteps, well water being drawn, and spoons clinking against pots. It was not a family, not yet something close, but it was no longer a place for just one man. Reed still kept his distance, but he knew something was beginning to change. Slowly, wordlessly, the morning sky was clear, and sunlight spread across the prairie like a golden carpet. Reed Callahan carried his hammer out to the northern fence, where the old wooden posts had long since collapsed. He was used to working alone, but this time, 2 figures followed behind him. Awanada, her shoulder wrapped in a strip of rough cloth to cover the wound, rolled up her sleeves and lifted a heavy log as if she felt no pain at all. The muscles in her shoulders flexed. Her sun-worn hands gripped the wood tightly, and she placed it cleanly into position. Reed frowned slightly, not in disapproval, but in surprise. He had not expected a woman to have that kind of strength and resolve. Tiva was not one to stand still either. The little girl carried small bundles of straw, helping gather dry grass for the cattle shed. A flock of curious chickens followed her around, making her laugh out loud. The sound echoed through the open yard, a sound Reed had not heard since the day he lost his family. By midday, the 3 of them sat beneath the shade of the old oak tree. Reed passed the water jug to Awanada. She took a sip, and something in her eyes softened. Tiva, sitting in the middle, opened a cloth pouch and shared what was left of some roasted corn, offering a handful to Reed. He accepted it slowly and gave a nod in place of thanks. That afternoon, they worked together to repair the roof of the horse shelter. Awanada climbed up, hammering wooden slats into place, sweat soaking the back of her shirt. Reed held the ladder steady below, occasionally glancing up, but his gaze was no longer filled with doubt. It had become something closer to quiet respect. Tiva, barefoot and dusty, stood nearby, handing them nails and tools, small, but eager to help in any way she could. By dusk, dinner felt different. Instead of silence, Awanada asked Reed a few short questions about the land, the crops. He answered gruffly, but his tone had lost its chill. Tiva jumped in, talking about the newborn calf, making both of them laugh. That night, Reed sat on the front porch, lighting his pipe and looking out over the yard, now tidier after a day of shared work. Inside the cabin, Awanada was folding her daughter's blanket, her movements firm but gentle. Reed took a long drag from his pipe and exhaled slowly. Inside him, something had begun to flicker, a warmth he thought had long since left him. It was not quite family, but this cabin no longer felt empty. I truly appreciate having you here, and if this story stirred up a memory maybe of dusty evenings and the sound of hooves echoing in your heart, then be sure to subscribe to my channel, so that each day we can sit together again, and I will tell you another story from the West. That night, the wind howled through the cracks in the door, blowing ashes in slow circles around the fire. Reed sat at the table, whittling a small piece of wood into a fishing lure with his pocket knife. Awanada sat across from him, stitching a torn shirt with coarse thread, while Tiva was already fast asleep, curled up in a blanket near the stove. The room was warm, but heavy with silence. After a long while, Awanada lowered her needle and looked up. Her eyes, dark and deep, met Reed's directly. "You probably want to know," she said softly, her voice low and hoarse, "why the girl and I ended up here." Reed did not answer. He simply gave a small nod, set the piece of wood aside, and waited. Awanada took a long breath. We used to live in Baker's Ridge. I belonged to a man there. He treated me like property. When I could no longer give him a son, he beat me, called me worthless. The whip marks, the broken arm. She lifted her bandaged arm, her hand trembling slightly. They are from him. Her voice faltered, but her gaze remained proud. I could not take it anymore. I took Tiva and ran. We wore our feet raw crossing the rocky hills, our stomachs empty, our legs bleeding, just to get away from his shadow. Silence settled over the cabin. Only the crackle of the firewood and the sound of wind sweeping across the porch remained. Reed slowly stood up, walked to the fireplace, and added another log. He said nothing, but as the flames rose, Awanada saw his eyes clearly cold gray, steady as steel. It was not pity in them, not curiosity, just understanding, and something like respect. Awanada lowered her head and spoke again, her voice even softer. If he comes here, I will leave. I do not want to bring trouble to your doorstep. Reed looked at her for a long moment, then slammed the knife down onto the wooden table, his voice low and firm. No one has the right to drag you back to that hell, not while you and the girl are standing on this land. Awanada froze. For a moment, something unreadable crossed her weathered face, confusion. Maybe then her expression softened into quiet gratitude. She said nothing more, just bent her head again, and kept sewing. Reed returned to the table and picked up the piece of wood. He continued carving, but deep inside, he knew from this moment on, their fates were tied together, even if no one said it out loud. That afternoon, the sky burned red like fire. The sun was close to setting, but its blazing light still scorched the prairie. Reed Callahan was tightening the reins on his horse when the old dog suddenly growled, fur bristling. The sound of hooves echoed in the distance, dry and pounding, like the beat of a funeral drum. Reed looked up, squinting. On the dusty red road leading to the ranch, a lone rider approached, tall and thin, his hat pulled low over half his face, but in the tilt of his shoulders and the way he rode, Reed knew right away. This was no harmless drifter. Awanada stepped onto the porch, one hand gripping the doorframe tightly. She recognized that silhouette even from 100 paces away. Her breathing quickened. Her wounded arm trembled slightly. "It is him," she whispered. Reed did not ask. He placed his hand on the grip of the Winchester, leaning against the water trough, his eyes turning cold as steel. The man stopped his horse just outside the gate and lifted his head. A long scar glinted across his cheek down to his chin in the light of the sunset. He let out a dry, mocking laugh, his voice rough and mean. "Awanada, you really think you can run from me? You're mine, woman. And that girl too. Both of you belong to me." Inside the cabin, Tiva let out a soft cry and clung tightly to her mother's dress. Awanada took a step forward, but Reed raised a hand to stop her. He stepped out onto the porch, tall and steady as a wooden post. "She does not belong to anyone," Reed said, his voice low and firm. The man laughed with contempt, but there was a flash of anger in his eyes. He drew his gun and pointed it straight at the porch. The air tightened, stretched taut like a bowstring. Reed did not blink. Calmly, almost too calmly, he raised the Winchester and cocked it with a sharp, echoing click that shattered the silence. The sound made the man's horse rear and whinny in panic, stomping the ground. "Put the gun down," Reed said, eyes locked on the target. "If you want to leave here alive." The man's jaw clenched, his finger twitching on the trigger. Awanada, behind Reed, held her breath. Tiva hid behind the door, eyes wide with fear. For a moment, the two men stood like mountains ready to crash into each other. Then, at last, the man let out a furious growl and lowered his weapon. "You will regret this, Cobb. The whole damn town will know you are harboring a savage woman." He turned his horse hard and rode off, vanishing into the swirling red dust of the dying Sunday. Reed lowered the Winchester, his face unchanged. He stepped back into the cabin, where Awanada was still shaking, holding Tiva close. With just one look, he said everything that needed to be said. From now on, he would not let them run anymore. 3 days later, a southern wind swept red dust across the prairie, thick as smoke. Reed Callahan stood on the front porch, eyes fixed on the dirt road. He knew that man would come back, and this time, he would not be alone. The sound of hooves thundered across the land, heavy and ominous, like war drums calling for vengeance. From the winding trail, 4 riders emerged from the haze. Leading them was the man from Baker's Ridge, his face twisted with hate, a pistol hanging at his side. He reined in his horse right at the fence, sneering as he called out, "Cobb, I warned you, but you would not listen. Hand over the woman and the girl, and I will let you keep your land. But if you do not," he growled, drawing his gun and pointing it straight, "we will burn this cabin to the ground." Awanada pulled Tiva back inside, fear in her eyes. Reed stepped down from the porch, Winchester firm in his grip, his voice rough and steady. "This is my land. No one is taking them anywhere." The air went still. One of the men flung a torch into the dry fence. Flames erupted in an instant, black smoke swirling into the sky. Laughter echoed through the heat. "Fire!" the leader roared. Gunshots cracked through the air. Bullets slammed into the wooden posts, splinters flying in every direction. Reed threw his rifle to his shoulder and fired. One man dropped from his horse, falling hard into the dust. Awanada, from behind the door, grabbed the hunting rifle Reed had set aside and fired a shot that shattered one of their wagon wheels, sending their horses into a frenzy. Tiva screamed, but Reed shouted, "Get down!" and dove to the side, firing a second round. The bullet grazed the leader's shoulder, making him howl in pain as he fired blindly back toward the cabin. Smoke, flames, and red dust blurred into a deadly storm. Reed dashed to the water trough, ducked behind a timber beam, and fired again. Another man clutched his gut and fell. Finally, as the fire still raged and the smoke had yet to clear, the leader snarled, "Fall back. Next time, I bring the whole damn town." He turned his horse and rode off, the last 2 men scrambling after him into the blood-red haze. The sound of hooves faded into the distance, leaving only the crackle of fire and the thick smell of gunpowder. Reed let out a breath, blood streaking down his shoulder. But his eyes remained cold as steel. He turned back to the cabin and saw Awanada standing in the doorway, her rifle still smoking, Tiva clutching her dress. In that moment, all 3 of them knew. This was no longer a place of temporary refuge. They had stood their ground together, and from now on, anyone who dared cross that fence would have to pay the price. Winter had passed, and the harsh, dry winds slowly gave way to a strange, gentle warmth. Across the fields surrounding the ranch, tiny blades of new grass pushed through the cracked earth. Birds returned, chirping on the porch roof still scorched with bullet scars. Reed Callahan leaned on his hoe, wiping the sweat from his brow. The arm that had once been grazed by a bullet was nearly healed now, leaving behind a scar as thin as a silver thread. Beside him, Awanada rolled up her sleeves, her strong arms tightening as she lifted a heavy wooden plank. Though her old wound was not fully healed, her eyes burned bright, the look of someone who had made her choice and would not turn back. On the porch, Tiva sat building a circle of stones, giggling with delight. Every time the wind blew her messy hair across her face, she turned and called out, "Mr. Reed, Mama says we are planting more corn today." Reed smiled, a smile he had not let show in a long time. "Yes, we are going to have one hell of a harvest." Day by day, the 3 of them rebuilt the fence that had burned, dug holes for planting seeds, and patched the cabin roof scarred by gunfire. None of them saw this place as temporary anymore. With every hammer strike, every row of turned soil, an unspoken vow took root. This is home. When night fell, the fire in the stove flickered, casting shadows across the wooden walls. Reed sat in his chair, while Tiva slept with her head resting in Awanada's lap. The Apache woman glanced over at Reed, her deep eyes no longer guarded, but quiet and warm. "You know," she whispered, "back in the tribe, I never thought I would have a home like this. It is wonderful." Reed nodded, the gray in his eyes etched with fatigue but also lit with something he had not felt in years. Hope. Outside, a crescent moon floated in the dark sky, shining down on the little cabin nestled in the vast prairie. But inside that wooden house, loneliness no longer lived. A rancher who had lost everything, a mother abandoned by the world, and a child who once seemed destined to grow up afraid they had found each other. They had not chosen the easy road, and they were far from accepted by the town of Red Bluff. But they had chosen each other, and that was enough to turn even this harsh land into a place called home. And as the first breeze of summer blew in, carrying the scent of fresh grass, Reed knew this was not just land. This was where his heart would stay. Dear friends, love in the frontier does not need promises or witnesses. It grows from calloused hands willing to lift each other up, from glances that understand the pain words cannot touch. In a land this unforgiving, love is the only strength that keeps us from being lost. Because when we dare to give our hearts, every wound can heal, and every house can rise again. And in the end, I wish for each of you a life full of happiness and health. I love you all, the cherished audience of Wild West storytelling. Let me know how this story made you feel. Leave a comment down below. Type 1 if you enjoyed the story. And do not forget to subscribe channel for more gripping tales from the Wild West.